I've spent the last week playing Saints Row on last-gen PS4 and Xbox One systems, and honestly, it's really not that bad. Well, not as bad as you'd think. Okay, it's still got big issues in polish and frame rate. At its core, we're still seeing the same basic, fundamental problems as the PS5 and Xbox Series X versions. The glaring shadow pop-in is back, and actually a bit worse here. The buggy NPC animations, physics return too, and perhaps inevitably the sub 60 FPS frame rates are still very much sub 60 FPS on PS4 and Xbox One. Actually, much lower. In fact, call it sub 40 FPS. At times, sub 30 FPS and under. But then this was on par with expectations, wasn't it? On PS5 and Series X, even across all those graphics modes, totaling 7 permutations, there was just no ideal way to enjoy the game at a locked 60 FPS. And so I was curious, booting the PS4 and Xbox One releases today, and of course Pro and One X as well, how does the frame rate, image quality, and general visual settings hold up? Are the visuals significantly downgraded, or is there a sense that Volition built Saints Row with all the consoles in mind first? Let's find out. Now, I'm going to cut to the point on this one. All 4 last-gen machines, PS4, Xbox One, Pro, and One X, offer no graphics mode toggle of any kind. It's one setup per console, what you see is what you get, which simplifies things massively. The second point is that, of course, visual tricks like ray-traced ambient occlusion, seen on PS5 and Series X, are totally absent here. It's just the regular screen space method for AO, but I think that's fine. And lastly, the third point, well, it's that all 4 consoles appear to use a fixed resolution target. All my pixel counts turn in consistent results on each platform, again making life very simple. More on the specifics in a moment, but I will say Volition's engine appears to be doing something unusual under the hood as well here. I say this because the HUD overlay, the mission prompts on the side, the texts, all appear to change resolution. They move, they scale, they adjust in clarity. So if we zoom in, notice how there's a kind of jitter effect as these elements adjust frame by frame. Now, with that in mind, dynamic resolution scaling, DRS, would explain this perfectly. DRS would also be a great fit for older GPU-limited hardware like Xbox One in adjusting for in-engine load. I'm not entirely ruling it out, except the resolution checks on actual in-game elements come out at often fixed values. So, a bit of a mystery, but I think it's worth noting. An odd quirk for sure. Possibly they're scaling to post effects or the anti-aliasing method causing this, but the actual in-engine native resolution is, broadly speaking, locked in place on each platform. So, with that out of the way, let's go in order from best to worst, shall we? From One X to PS4 Pro, to base PS4 to, yes, the Xbox One S. Let's see what we've got, starting with One X first here. You'd expect Xbox One X to turn in the best results of the 4, and that's partly true. At least in image quality, you're getting a very decent turnout here at a native 2560 by 1440. Now, 1440p goes beyond what a PS4 Pro pushes in pixel counts, which we'll get to. More crucially though, image quality on One X trumps the native 1080p on Series S, a machine that's meant to be a generation ahead. Here's a comparison between the two, 1440p on left on One X and 1080p on Series S on the right. Almost every other setting is exactly identical between them, I will say. Put this down to One X's higher rated 6 teraflop GPU compared to Series S's 4 teraflops. Even being based on the more current RDNA 2 architecture, Series S doesn't seem to compete in its support for 4K displays here. As a result, absolutely, zooming in, the picture is clearer even on our aging One X. That's not to say Series S has no plus sides. Zooming in again, you'll notice it actually runs on a higher grass density setting than One X, filling out this canyon with more plants. That's about the extent of the advantage visually though, the rest is the same. Also, another positive on Series S is by running at 1080p, it has a massive frame rate advantage at around 40 to 60 FPS. It never entirely gets to a full 60 FPS in this Starship Trooper set piece of course, but still, it's so much closer to it than Xbox One X if we switch over to that now. Here's the same sequence at the same core visual settings outside of resolution and plant density, and yet One X runs at a much lower 30 to 40 FPS range and at times even under 30 FPS. There's no 30 FPS cap here once again, which is true of all last gen machines, and so we're left with a frame rate reading that's totally unlocked. For a more relative comparison of the divide, we're talking up to a 15 FPS lead in favour of Series S, which does put it in a much better range for VRR compatible displays. One X's performance is a real disappointment here. You have to wonder how much better it could be if you put a 30 FPS cap in place too. Even then though, we'd have been faced with these sub 30 FPS drops. I mean, major cutscene action drags it down to as low as 24 FPS. It's all very cinematic, and then there's the high-speed chases around canyon areas, which just dips Xbox One X into the 20s too. On balance, it's between 30 to 40 FPS at most points, which again would have worked with a 30 FPS cap. Switching over to the PS4 Pro next, it's actually surprising to find these areas run better than One X. In fact, the entire game runs at around 3 to 5 FPS to the better overall. Again, PS4 Pro runs at the same fundamental settings in shadow quality, geometry draw, and so on, so the big difference is that it runs at a native 1080p resolution, much the same as Series S. Performance on PS4 Pro is generally in the same 30 to 40 FPS ballpark, if consistently a few frames higher on average. In other words, more often than not, it's closer to the 40 FPS line than One X. We're also still seeing drops under 30 on Pro, but less frequently, so overall, the move to a native 1080p here does feel a bit underwhelming from a visual standpoint, but it makes sense. It's a resolution drop that matches the drop in GPU power to 4.2 teraflops on PS4 Pro, relative to One X's 6 teraflops pushing 1440p. And the net positive, it kind of leapfrogs One X's frame rate and lands us with a slight performance advantage by comparison. Again, it doesn't really save the day, and PS4 Pro is truly, desperately in need of a 30 FPS cap from Volition, but if we're after the best performing last gen version, this would be it. Next along is the base PS4. This is where performance and visuals start to show serious rough edges. Now, if we're talking visuals alone, this is a step down from PS4 Pro, even if the resolution itself surprisingly stays the same. So you get a straight 1920 by 1080 native resolution on PS4, so 1080p stays in place, but in terms of visuals, there's a big downgrade elsewhere. Grass density, for example, as is evident in this runaround, gets reduced dramatically. Simply put, PS4 Pro and One X by extension render more foliage in busy outback areas. And as we drive forward as well, slowly, you'll also notice shadow draw distances are pruned back on the base machine across the roads. It gives a sparser appearance next to Pro, with the cascade adding shade much closer to the screen. Another big downgrade, well, that'd be the shadow quality itself when viewed right up close. In side-by-sides, base PS4 sees a drastic hit to shadow resolution. And to be clear, both PS4 and Xbox One X share the same setting here, while Pro and One X use the higher, cleaner shadow preset. And perhaps the last major downgrade is in the effects quality on base PS4 and Xbox One as well, shown here. Everything from the dust during the canyon chase to even water and fire are affected, with lower resolution transparencies visibly affecting the look of the game. Most other settings are remarkably similar between PS4 and PS4 Pro. SSR quality for reflections appears to be a match, though ambient occlusion quality is a lower preset. Perhaps the biggest issue with base PS4 and Xbox One, though, is the frame rate. Performance hovers at the 30 FPS line, wavering just over and under all the way through. Sometimes the variance is by 2 to 3 FPS, but it's always around that central 30 FPS figure. The fact it stabilizes around this 30 FPS number does, again, suggest DRS may be in effect, but the fact is 1080p comes up in every single pixel count. So one theory is that there's a dynamic nature to the visual settings themselves, to ambient occlusion, post effects and more, similar to how Elden Ring works. It'd certainly explain how and why the frame rate clings to 30 FPS almost like it's being guided to that 30 FPS mark. And also, it'd explain how it does this without a 30 FPS cap too. So it's all round a very curious situation. Now, sadly, we do see the other extremes too. This taxing cutscene drops us to just under 20 FPS, which isn't great. It's very unusual to see gameplay itself go this low though. On the flip side, less demanding areas will veer up to the 45 FPS mark, and even higher if you look to the sky of course, but still, generally speaking, base PS4 is at the 30 FPS mark for most inner city gameplay and combat too. Last up of course is base Xbox One. Resolution wise, this typically runs at around 1536 by 864, and at 864p it's also of course the softest, least presentable version of Saints Row going. All the downgrades mentioned on base PS4 translate here too. The low quality shadows, the downgraded effects resolution, limited draw distances, low grass density, all of it. Remarkably though, turning to frame rate performance, base Xbox One is slightly better off than PS4 in most areas. For example, our base PS4 here hovers between 30 to 35 FPS during this canyon chase. It's not at all a bad turnout on Sony's console, but still, if we switch over to Xbox One, this then moves up to the 35 to 40 FPS range. It's around 3 to 5 FPS higher during peak action, in other words, perhaps a sign of how effective dropping the resolution is in Volition's engine. In other words, setting Xbox One to sub 900p, the frame rate turns out to be better than I'd expected. Okay, most of gameplay around the city, with lots of CPU taxing elements like physics, AI, take it down to 30 FPS, and honestly, once again, a 30 FPS cap would have worked just fine here. All round, and surprisingly, Saints Row isn't a total catastrophe on any of these four older systems. PS4 Pro, for its part, offers the smoothest frame rate of the bunch, Xbox One X has the best image quality at 1440p, and even base Xbox One turns in frame rate often above 30 FPS. The visual cutbacks are glaring, especially on base PS4 and Xbox One, but all releases are playable, and in fact, they might be very decent if a 30 FPS cap was in place. Even going in with relatively low expectations then, it's hardly the ideal way to play Saints Row, but not radically off the mark. So I left this for last. Here's base PS4 versus a PS5 on its 1440p high quality mode, ray traced AO included. The resolution upgrade, the better draw distances, shadows, all stick out on Sony's new hardware, but in broad strokes, it's hardly what I'd call a generational divide. What we're seeing in Saints Row is a project clearly built with older PS4 and Xbox One era limits in mind. For its AI systems, the framework of its world, it does end up feeling like a last-gen project scaled up. The benefit being, even with Saints Row's bugs, which are present on every system, the game still looks and runs better than you think on PS4 and Xbox One. It's hard to wholeheartedly recommend any of the last-gen versions. Honestly, mostly I went into this expecting the worst, especially on base Xbox One, but it turns out all four machines do run Saints Row well enough. And of course, with more patch updates to address its bugs, this could be turned around, and I really hope the game gets the attention it deserves. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this quick look at the last gen versions of Saints Row, do feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter as usual. But from me for now, thanks for watching.